Millionaire CEO never believed the black woman to be his mother after comforting her child inside plane to Hawaii. A millionaire CEO thought he was just calming a scared child on a turbulent flight to Hawaii. He had no idea he was about to discover the mother who gave him up 28 years ago was sitting right beside him. What happened next will restore your faith in destiny and prove that some connections are too powerful to stay hidden forever. This is their incredible true story. Before we explore deep into this story, please let me know in the comment where you are watching from. Hit subscribe if you are hooked in and ready to enjoy the story. Because tomorrow, I have another beautiful story to share with you, and I do want you to miss it for anything. Now let's get into the story. The first-class cabin of Flight 447 to Honolulu hummed with quiet efficiency. Jonathan Mitchell adjusted his platinum cufflinks and glanced at his Patek Philippe watch, a gesture born more from habit than necessity. At 32, he commanded boardrooms with the same cold precision that had built his tech empire from nothing, or so he told himself. The truth was Messier, buried beneath years of foster homes, and a carefully constructed identity that began the day he turned 18 and legally changed his name from whoever he'd been before. He opened his laptop, the glow illuminating sharp cheekbones and eyes the color of winter storms. 3 acquisition deals awaited his signature, each worth more than most people earned in a lifetime. This Hawaii trip wasn't a vacation, it was a conquest. A struggling hotel chain ripe for his particular brand of corporate surgery. He'd learned long ago that sentiment was a luxury he couldn't afford, especially when it came to family. Blood meant nothing when it had abandoned you first. The flight attendant offered champagne with a practiced smile. Jonathan declined with a curt nod, his attention already absorbed by profit margins and projected revenue streams. Around him, other passengers settled into their leather cocoons, but he remained an island of controlled energy, radiating the kind of success that intimidated and impressed in equal measure. 30 rows behind, in the cramped quarters of economy class, Keisha Washington bounced her 4-year-old son Aiden on her lap, whispering soft reassurances as the plane prepared for takeoff. Her hands, weathered from double shifts at the hotel where she cleaned rooms, smoothed his curly hair, a perfect blend of her rich brown skin and features that spoke of mixed heritage. "Mama, my ears hurt," Aiden whimpered, pressing his small face against her shoulder. "I know, baby. Here, chew this gum. It'll help." She unwrapped a piece with trembling fingers, her own anxiety about flying mixing with the weight of this journey. 28 years of searching had led to this moment. A single lead about a boy who'd aged out of the Los Angeles foster system and might be her son. The son she'd been forced to give up when she was barely 16, homeless and broken by circumstances beyond her control. The photo in her purse was worn from handling. A professional headshot she'd found online of Jonathan Mitchell, CEO of Mitchell Technologies. Something about his eyes, the stubborn set of his jaw, reminded her of the baby she'd held for exactly 47 minutes before the social worker took him away. She'd named him Thomas, after her father, but knew the system would change everything about him, including his identity. "We're going to meet someone special in Hawaii," she whispered to Aiden, though her voice carried the weight of uncertainty. What if she was wrong? What if 28 years of guilt and hope had made her see connections that didn't exist? The airplane engines roared to life, drowning out the sound of her rapid heartbeat. She'd spent her life savings on these tickets, taking a leap of faith that terrified her. Her sister had called her crazy for chasing ghosts, but Keisha knew in her bones that some connections transcended time and distance. Aiden nestled closer, his small hand clutching her worn jacket. At 4, he was already showing signs of the intelligence that had always made Keisha wonder about his father's genetics. A white man who disappeared the moment she'd told him about the pregnancy. But it was more than intelligence. It was something in the way Aiden observed the world, calculating and careful, that reminded her of those precious minutes with her firstborn. As the plane climbed through the clouds, both passengers stared out their respective windows at the same vast sky, unaware that destiny was about to collide in the most unexpected way. Jonathan saw opportunity in the endless blue horizon, new markets to conquer, new acquisitions to complete. Keisha saw possibility and fear intertwined, carrying her toward a reunion that might heal or destroy the carefully constructed hope that had sustained her for decades. Neither knew that in a few hours, turbulence would shake more than just the aircraft, forcing two strangers into a moment of raw humanity that would shatter everything they thought they knew about family, identity, and the invisible threads that bind us together. The flight attendant's voice crackled over the intercom, welcoming passengers to their journey to paradise. But paradise, they would soon discover, sometimes came disguised as the most ordinary moments of human kindness. Have you ever judged someone based on first impressions, only to discover you were completely wrong about who they really were? 2 hours into the flight, the Pacific Ocean stretched endlessly below as the plane hit its first pocket of turbulence. What started as gentle bumps quickly escalated into violent shaking that sent service carts rattling and passengers gripping their armrests with white knuckles. In first class, Jonathan barely looked up from his laptop as champagne flutes clinked against each other in their holders. He'd flown through worse turbulence during red-eye flights to Tokyo. His fingers continued typing acquisition terms with mechanical precision, each keystroke a barrier between himself and the world around him. But then he heard it, a child's terrified scream cutting through the drone of engines and nervous adult murmurs. The sound hit him like a physical blow, bypassing every carefully constructed wall he'd built around his emotions. His fingers froze above the keyboard as something deep and primal stirred in his chest, a recognition he couldn't name or understand. "Mama." The voice cracked with pure terror as the plane dropped suddenly, sending unsecured items flying. "Mama, I'm scared." Jonathan's head snapped up, his storm-gray eyes scanning the cabin with sudden intensity. The flight attendants were strapped into their jump seats, unable to move during the severe turbulence, their faces tight with professional concern masking personal fear. Another violent shake threw passengers sideways. The child's sobbing grew more desperate, wordless now except for the universal cry that transcended language. A small human calling for safety in a world that had suddenly become terrifyingly unpredictable. Without conscious thought, Jonathan's hands moved to unbuckle his seatbelt. The businessman beside him grabbed his arm. "Sir, you need to stay seated during turbulence." But Jonathan was already standing, his 6-foot frame swaying with the aircraft's movements as he made his way toward economy class. Each step felt guided by an invisible force he couldn't explain, some compass in his soul pointing toward that desperate voice. The economy section was chaotic. Overhead bins had opened, spilling belongings into the aisles. Parents held their children tightly, while single travelers gripped whatever they could find. But Jonathan's attention locked onto a single seat near the back, where a young black woman clutched a biracial boy who couldn't have been older than 4. Keisha's dark eyes were wide with her own terror, but every ounce of her energy focused on calming her son. "It's okay, Aiden. Mama's here. The plane is just dancing with the clouds, baby." But Aiden was beyond comfort, his small body rigid with fear as he pressed his face into his mother's neck, tiny hands fisted in her shirt. The plane dropped again, and this time the child's scream was pure anguish, the sound of someone too young to understand that safety could ever return. Jonathan reached their row just as the worst turbulence hit. Without asking permission, without introducing himself, without any of the social protocols that governed his ordered world, he dropped into the empty middle seat beside them and spoke in a voice softer than he'd used in years. "Hey there, little man." Aiden's tear-streaked face turned toward him, brown eyes wide with confusion and fear. Up close, Jonathan could see the delicate features that blended his mother's beauty with something else, something that made his chest tighten inexplicably. "What's your name?" Jonathan asked, his usual corporate authority replaced by gentle curiosity. Aiden," the boy hiccuped. "That's a strong name. You know what, Aiden? I used to be scared of flying too." The lie came easily, but the tenderness in his voice was completely genuine. "Want to know a secret about airplanes?" The child nodded, still clinging to his mother but now listening. Jonathan pulled out his phone and switched it to airplane mode, the screen displaying a simple flight tracking app. See this? This shows exactly where we are. And look, he pointed to the smooth line representing their flight path. We're almost through the bumpy part. In about 10 minutes, it's going to be smooth as glass again. Keisha watched this stranger comfort her son with a mixture of gratitude and something else, a recognition that made her breath catch. The way he held his head when he concentrated, the gentle authority in his voice, the instinctive way he'd known exactly how to reach a frightened child. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the engine noise. Jonathan looked up and met her eyes for the first time. In that instant, something passed between them, not romantic, but deeper, more elemental, like looking into a mirror that reflected not appearance but essence. "He's beautiful," Jonathan said simply, and meant it with a sincerity that surprised them both. As if summoned by their connection, the turbulence began to ease. The violent shaking subsided into gentle swaying, then smoothness. True to Jonathan's prediction, the ride became calm again. But neither adult moved. Jonathan remained in the middle seat, Aiden now relaxed against his mother's chest, but watching this kind stranger with curious eyes. The moment stretched, filled with unspoken questions and impossible possibilities. "I should get back," Jonathan finally said, though he made no move to leave. "Of course," Keisha replied, though her voice carried the same reluctance. As he stood to return to first class, Aiden's small hand shot out and grabbed his wrist. "Will you come back if it gets scary again?" Jonathan looked down at the little boy, then at the woman whose eyes held a lifetime of stories he somehow wanted to hear, and felt something crack open in his chest, something he'd kept sealed for 32 years. "Yes," he promised. "I'll come back." Back in first class, Jonathan stared at his laptop screen without seeing the numbers. His hands rested motionless on the keyboard, but his mind replayed every detail of the past 20 minutes. The child's tear-streaked face, the mother's grateful eyes, the inexplicable pull he'd felt toward their crisis. He shook his head sharply and forced himself to focus on the Henderson Hotel acquisition. Numbers, facts, projections. These were safe territories where emotions couldn't ambush him. But every few minutes, his concentration wavered as he remembered the weight of small fingers on his wrist and a promise he had no business making. "Ridiculous," he muttered under his breath, attacking the spreadsheet with renewed determination. He was a businessman, not a children's entertainer. That moment of weakness, because that's what it had been, weakness, couldn't happen again. He had responsibilities, a reputation to maintain. CEOs didn't comfort random children on airplanes. They focused on profit margins and market dominance. Yet when he closed his eyes, he could still hear Aiden's voice saying his name with perfect trust. 30 rows behind, Keisha held her sleeping son and tried to calm her racing heart. The stranger's kindness should have felt like a blessing, nothing more. Instead, it had triggered something deeper, a recognition that made her hands tremble as she smoothed Aiden's curls. She pulled out her phone and stared at the photo of Jonathan Mitchell she'd saved from his company's website. The professional headshot showed a cold, calculating executive in an expensive suit, nothing like the gentle man who'd instinctively known how to comfort a frightened child. But the bone structure was the same, the stubborn set of the jaw, the way his eyes focused with laser intensity. "Stop it," she whispered to herself. "You're seeing what you want to see." 28 years of searching had trained her to spot phantom connections everywhere. A waiter with familiar hands, a college student with her son's smile, a businessman on the news whose success story echoed her dreams for the child she'd lost. She'd learned the hard way that hope could be crueler than despair, painting possibilities where none existed. But this felt different. The way he'd moved toward Aiden's cries without hesitation, as if pulled by invisible strings. The gentleness that had transformed his entire demeanor. The moment their eyes had met, and she'd felt the earth shift beneath her feet. The passenger beside her shifted, and Keisha quickly put her phone away. She couldn't afford to chase ghosts, especially not now when Aiden needed stability. This trip to Hawaii was supposed to be their fresh start, a new job opportunity, a chance to build something better. Getting tangled up in impossible fantasies about the stranger in first class would only lead to heartbreak. Still, she found herself glancing toward the front of the plane, wondering what he was thinking, whether he'd felt that same electric moment of recognition. Jonathan ordered his third coffee, though caffeine was the last thing his wired system needed. The flight attendant, a middle-aged woman named Patricia, noticed his agitation. "Rough flight?" she asked with professional sympathy. "Fine," he replied curtly, then caught himself. "Sorry. Yes, a bit rough." Patricia's expression softened. "I saw what you did back there. That was very kind." Jonathan's jaw tightened. "I just helped calm a frightened child. Nothing more." "Of course," Patricia agreed, but her knowing smile suggested she'd seen something he wasn't ready to acknowledge. Still, not everyone would have left their seat during turbulence like that. The boy and his mother were lucky you were here. After she moved on, Jonathan found himself analyzing that word, lucky. Luck implied chance, randomness, the kind of cosmic coincidence he'd stopped believing in years ago. Everything in his life had been calculated, planned, earned through relentless effort. There was no room for luck or fate or whatever force had compelled him to comfort a stranger's child. Yet he couldn't shake the memory of how natural it had felt, how easily the words had come. He'd never been good with children, had actively avoided them, actually. Kids represented chaos, unpredictability, emotional messiness he couldn't control. So why had comforting Aiden felt like the most natural thing in the world? Meanwhile, Keisha battled her own internal storm. Every rational thought told her to forget the encounter, to focus on the new life waiting in Hawaii. But her heart whispered dangerous possibilities, spinning scenarios where the impossible became possible. She thought about the adoption records she'd fought to unseal, the dead ends and false leads that had punctuated her search. She'd been told her son was placed with a good family, that he'd been given opportunities she never could have provided. Looking at Jonathan Mitchell's success story, self-made millionaire, tech innovator, philanthropist, she could almost believe the system had worked perfectly. Except for the part where he was alone. No wedding ring, no family photos visible during their brief interaction, just the cold efficiency of someone who'd learned to rely only on himself. The very success she'd hoped for her son might have come at the cost of connection, of knowing where he came from. "Mama." Aiden stirred in her arms, blinking sleepy eyes. "Is the nice man gonna come back?" Keisha's throat tightened. "I don't know, baby. He's probably busy with his work." "But he promised," Aiden said with the absolute faith that only children possessed. As if summoned by their conversation, a movement in the front cabin caught her attention. Jonathan was standing again, stretching his legs near the first-class galley. Their eyes met across 30 rows of passengers, and for a heart-stopping moment, neither looked away. Then he turned abruptly and disappeared into the lavatory, breaking the connection and leaving Keisha to wonder if she'd imagined the longing in his expression, or if she'd simply projected her own desperate hope onto a stranger's face. The plane flew steadily toward Hawaii, carrying two people running from the same truth in opposite directions. The captain's voice crackled over the intercom with news that made every passenger's heart sink. "Ladies and gentlemen, due to severe weather conditions at Honolulu International, we're being diverted to Kahului Airport on Maui. We'll need to remain on the aircraft for approximately 2 hours while the storm system passes through Oahu." Jonathan cursed under his breath. His carefully scheduled meetings would have to be rearranged, contracts delayed, time lost. He reached for his phone to call his assistant, then remembered they were still in flight mode. The feeling of being trapped, of losing control, made his chest tighten with familiar anxiety. In the economy, Keisha felt her own wave of panic. The hotel job interview that had brought them to Hawaii was scheduled for tomorrow morning on Oahu. Missing it meant losing their chance at a new life, at stability for Aiden. She'd spent her last savings on these tickets, burning bridges in Los Angeles to chase this opportunity. "How long, Mama?" Aiden asked, picking up on her tension. Just a little longer, baby, she lied, forcing calm into her voice while her mind raced through impossible logistics. 20 minutes later, the plane touched down on Maui's runway under slate-gray skies heavy with rain. The aircraft parked away from the terminal, leaving passengers stranded in a metal tube with nowhere to go. The air conditioning struggled against the tropical humidity, and the recycled air grew thick and stifling. Jonathan loosened his tie, feeling claustrophobic in a way that had nothing to do with the physical space. Being trapped always triggered memories he preferred to keep buried. Foster homes where he'd had no escape, social workers who'd moved him like cargo, the suffocating helplessness of having no control over his own destiny. He stood to use the lavatory, needing movement to calm his rising anxiety. But as he made his way down the aisle, he heard a commotion from the back of the plane. "Please, he gets panic attacks in small spaces," Keisha was pleading with a flight attendant. "I just need to walk him up and down the aisle for a few minutes." Aiden was hyperventilating, his small chest rising and falling rapidly as tears streamed down his face. The confined space and delayed journey had triggered something primal in the 4-year-old, and his distress was escalating quickly. "I'm sorry, ma'am, but passengers need to remain seated during ground delays," the flight attendant replied, sympathy warring with protocol in her voice. Jonathan found himself stepping forward before conscious thought could stop him. "What seems to be the problem?" The flight attendant turned, recognizing him from first class. "Sir, this little boy is having some difficulty with the delay, but we can't allow passengers to move freely in the cabin right now." Jonathan looked down at Aiden, whose brown eyes were wide with the kind of fear he recognized intimately. The trapped, cornered terror of someone too small to fight circumstances beyond their control. "What if I took responsibility for them?" Jonathan heard himself saying. "I have experience with anxiety management." The lie came smoothly, but the offer was genuine. Something about the child's panic spoke to his own buried trauma, awakening protective instincts he'd thought long dead. Keisha stared at him in amazement. "You don't have to." "I want to," Jonathan said simply, meeting her eyes with an intensity that made her breath catch. The flight attendant hesitated, then made a decision that bent regulations in favor of compassion. 5 minutes. Stay in the back section." Jonathan knelt beside Aiden's seat, bringing himself to eye level with the frightened boy. "Remember me? I promised I'd come back if things got scary." Aiden nodded, still breathing too fast but focusing on Jonathan's calm presence. "You know what helps when I feel trapped?" Jonathan asked, his voice gentle but steady. "I close my eyes and imagine I'm somewhere really big, like standing on top of a mountain where I can see forever." As he spoke, Jonathan found himself drawing on memories he'd almost forgotten. A foster father who'd taught him breathing techniques during his own panic attacks, the visualization exercises that had helped him survive the suffocating fear of abandonment. "Can you try that with me?" he asked Aiden. For the next few minutes, Jonathan guided both mother and son through breathing exercises, his corporate training in crisis management merging unexpectedly with deeply personal experience. He told them stories about wide open spaces, beaches in California, mountain ranges in Colorado, endless skies that proved the world was bigger than any temporary confinement. Gradually, Aiden's breathing slowed. His grip on his mother's hand loosened, and the rigid terror left his small body. "Better?" Jonathan asked. Aiden nodded, then surprised everyone by reaching out and taking Jonathan's hand with his free one, creating a chain of connection between the three of them. "You're really good at this," Keisha said softly, studying Jonathan's face with new understanding. "You said you had experience with anxiety management." Jonathan's jaw tightened slightly. He'd revealed more than intended, let down guards he'd spent years building. Everyone has experience with fear. But Keisha caught the careful evasion, the way his eyes shuddered when she got too close to something personal. She recognized the deflection because she used it herself, the survivor's instinct to protect vulnerable truths from scrutiny. "Thank you," she said instead of pushing, "for both times today. I don't know how to repay such kindness." Jonathan looked down at their joined hands, his pale fingers intertwined with Aiden's smaller brown ones, the child serving as an innocent bridge between two adults who were circling around something neither dared name. "You don't owe me anything," he said, but made no move to break the connection. They sat in comfortable silence as rain drummed against the aircraft windows, three strangers bound together by circumstance and something deeper, a recognition that grew stronger with each passing moment, despite their resistance to acknowledge it. Outside, the storm raged on, keeping them suspended between destinations, between past and future, between the lives they'd built separately and the possibility of something neither had dared imagine. The rain continued its relentless percussion against the aircraft windows as passengers settled into the uncomfortable reality of an extended delay. Most had dozed off or buried themselves in books and devices, but Jonathan found himself unable to return to first class. Something invisible tethered him to the back section where Keisha and Aiden waited. "Tell me about the mountain," Aiden said sleepily, still holding Jonathan's hand with the unconscious trust that only children possessed. Jonathan found himself describing places he'd barely thought about in years. Foster homes in Colorado, where he'd learned to find peace in vast landscapes. Group homes in Montana, where the sky stretched endlessly beyond institutional walls. As he spoke, he realized these weren't just stories he was sharing. They were fragments of a carefully buried past. "You lived in lots of places," Aiden observed with 4-year-old directness. "I did," Jonathan admitted, his throat unexpectedly tight. Keisha watched the exchange with growing recognition. The way Jonathan spoke about moving from place to place, the careful distance in his voice when mentioning homes that clearly weren't homes at all. She'd heard that tone before from other survivors of the system that had swallowed her son. "Were you in foster care?" she asked gently, her social worker instincts recognizing the signs. Jonathan's hand stiffened in Aiden's grip, but he didn't pull away. For a while, the admission hung in the recycled air between them, heavier than the tropical humidity. Keisha felt her heart rate accelerate, but forced herself to remain calm, to not push too hard too fast. "I work with families in transition," she said carefully. "In Los Angeles. It's how I know the signs." Jonathan studied her face, searching for judgment or pity and finding only understanding. "You're a social worker?" "Hotel housekeeper, actually. But I volunteer at a family services center." She didn't mention that most of her volunteer work involved searching adoption records, following leads about children who'd aged out of the system, hoping against hope to find traces of the son she'd lost. Aiden shifted against his mother's shoulder, and something fell from her purse, a worn photograph that fluttered to the floor. Jonathan automatically reached for it, intending to hand it back, but froze when he saw what it was. His own face stared back at him from a professional headshot, the corporate photo from his company's website. But this wasn't a screenshot or printout. It was a physical photograph, creased from handling, the edges soft with age and repeated touching. "Why do you have my picture?" he asked, his voice carefully controlled but his eyes sharp with suspicion. Keisha's face went pale. She'd been so careful to keep the photo hidden, but exhaustion and emotion had made her careless. Now her deepest secret lay exposed between them, and there was no taking it back. I can explain," she stammered, reaching for the photograph with trembling hands. But Jonathan held on to it, studying her face with the same analytical intensity he brought to business acquisitions. "Are you some kind of reporter? Industrial spy?" His voice carried the cold edge that made corporate rivals tremble. "No." Keisha's denial was fierce, protective. "It's not like that at all." Aiden sensed the tension and pressed closer to his mother, his earlier calm evaporating. "Mama, what's wrong?" Jonathan's expression softened slightly at the child's distress, but his guard remained up. "Then explain why you're carrying around my photograph." Keisha closed her eyes, knowing this moment would either change everything or destroy the fragile connection they'd built. When she opened them again, her voice was barely above a whisper. "Because I believe, you might be my son." The words hit Jonathan like a physical blow. He stared at her as if she'd spoken in a foreign language, his mind rejecting what it had heard, even as his heart began racing with recognition he couldn't allow. "That's impossible," he said flatly, but his hands were shaking now. "I gave birth to a baby boy 28 years ago," Keisha continued, her words coming faster now that the truth was finally free. "In Los Angeles. I was 16, homeless, with no family support. The state took him when he was 2 days old. I named him Thomas, but I knew they'd change everything about him, his name, his history, his identity." Jonathan felt the airplane walls closing in around him, the familiar panic of being trapped mixing with something deeper and more terrifying. Stop. But Keisha couldn't stop now, 28 years of grief and hope pouring out in a rush. The father was white, a college student who disappeared when I told him I was pregnant. The baby would have been mixed race, like Aiden, born in March of 1997. They told me he was placed with a good family, that he'd have opportunities one couldn't give him. "Stop," Jonathan repeated, but his voice cracked on the word. "I've been searching for him ever since, following every lead, every possibility. When I saw your photo online, read your biography, successful businessman, born in LA, no family mentioned, something just—" She touched her chest, over her heart. "Something just new." Jonathan stood abruptly, the photograph falling to the floor between them. His carefully constructed world was cracking apart, all the walls he'd built to separate himself from his origins crumbling under the weight of possibility. "You don't know anything about me," he said harshly, backing away from them both. "My birthday, my birth name, medical records. You're just another person chasing fantasies." But even as he said it, he was calculating dates in his head, remembering fragments of his earliest memories. Los Angeles County Children's Services, a social worker named Mrs. Patterson who'd explained why his name was being changed, the careful way officials had avoided mentioning his birth mother except to say she'd been very young and unable to provide care. Keisha reached into her purse with shaking hands and pulled out an envelope, worn thin from years of handling. March 15th, 1997. 6:23 a.m. Cedars-Sinai Medical Center. 7 pounds, 2 ounces. Birth name, Thomas Washington. Jonathan's face went white. His birthday. His birth weight. Details that weren't public knowledge, that existed only in sealed records he'd never tried to access because knowing felt more dangerous than not knowing. "I held you for 47 minutes, Keisha whispered, tears streaming down her face. 47 minutes before they took you away. And I've regretted letting go every single day since." Jonathan stood frozen in the aisle, his world tilting on its axis as 28 years of carefully constructed identity crumbled around him. The photograph lay forgotten on the floor between them, but the truth it represented hung in the air like electricity before a storm. 47 minutes, he repeated numbly, the number carving itself into his consciousness. Keisha nodded, fresh tears spilling down her cheeks. "I counted every second. The nurses said I should let go, that it would be easier, but I couldn't. You had this tiny birthmark on your left shoulder, shaped like a crescent moon. And your eyes, they were this gray-blue color, like storm clouds." Without conscious thought, Jonathan's hand moved to his left shoulder, where beneath his expensive shirt lay the exact mark she'd described. A detail no public biography would ever include, no corporate headshot would reveal. "This is insane," he whispered, but his voice carried wonder now instead of denial. Aiden had been watching the exchange with wide eyes, not understanding the full implications, but sensing the magnitude of the moment. He tugged on his mother's sleeve. "Mama, why are you crying?" Keisha knelt down to his level, struggling to find words a 4-year-old could comprehend. "Remember how I told you we were going to meet someone special in Hawaii?" Aiden nodded solemnly. "Well, sometimes the universe surprises us. Sometimes special people find us when we're not even looking." She glanced up at Jonathan, who was still standing as if rooted to the spot. "This is Jonathan, and I think he might be your big brother." The simple explanation hit Jonathan harder than all the dates and details combined. Big brother. Family. Words he'd convinced himself he didn't need, concepts he deliberately avoided because wanting them hurt too much. Aiden studied Jonathan with new interest. "You're really tall for a brother." Despite everything, Jonathan felt his lips twitch in an almost smile. "You're pretty smart for a little brother." The casual exchange broke something loose in Jonathan's chest. He found himself sitting back down, no longer trying to escape, but drawn inexorably toward this impossible new reality. "I don't know how to do this," he admitted quietly, his corporate confidence stripped away to reveal something raw and vulnerable. "I don't know how to be family." Keisha's expression softened with understanding. "I don't either. I gave you up because I thought someone else could give you a better life, and then I spent 30 years wondering if I made the right choice. Looking at what you've accomplished, what you've built." She gestured vaguely toward first class, toward the life of success and achievement he'd created. "Maybe I did." "No," Jonathan said sharply, surprising them both with his vehemence. "You didn't. I mean," he struggled to find words for truths he'd never spoken aloud. "I succeeded because I had to. Because I learned early that if I didn't take care of myself, no one else would. But success isn't the same thing as happiness. It's not the same thing as belonging." He looked at Aiden, who was coloring in a book while half listening to their conversation, radiating the kind of security that came from being unconditionally loved. "He has something I never had. He has you." "You could have had me too," Keisha said softly. "If circumstances had been different. If I'd been older, more stable, if I'd had support." She shook her head. "I've played the what-if game for 28 years. It doesn't change anything." Jonathan studied her face, seeing strength forged by hardship, love that had survived decades of separation, hope that had endured countless disappointments. "Tell me about that day. The real story." So Keisha did. She told him about being 16 and alone, about sleeping in her car when she could borrow one, in shelters when she couldn't, about working minimum wage jobs while her belly grew, saving every penny for baby supplies she'd never get to use, about the labor that came too early, the premature birth that terrified her but produced a perfect, healthy boy who looked at her with ancient wisdom in infant eyes. "I sang to you," she remembered, her voice thick with emotion. "An old lullaby my grandmother used to sing to me. I wanted your first memory to be love, even if it was the only memory you'd have of me." Jonathan felt something crack open inside his chest, a door he'd welded shut long ago creaking open to let in dangerous light. "What was the song?" Keisha's voice was barely a whisper as she began to hum, then sing softly. "Hush now, my baby, be still in love, don't cry. Sleep as you're rocked by the stream. Hush now, my baby, the sun's in the sky, and you are my heart's sweetest dream." The melody hit Jonathan like a physical force, unlocking something buried so deep he'd forgotten it existed. Suddenly he was small again, scared and alone in his first foster home, humming a tune he couldn't remember learning, finding comfort in notes that seemed to come from somewhere beyond memory. "I know that song," he breathed, wondering and pain warring in his expression. "I've hummed it my whole life and never knew where it came from." Aiden looked up from his coloring book. "Mama sings that to me too. It's our special song." The simple statement created a bridge across 28 years of separation, connecting past and present, mother and sons, loss and recovery. They sat in silence for a moment, feeling the weight of recognition settle around them like a blanket. "I was so angry," Jonathan admitted finally, "at whoever gave me up. I told myself they were selfish, that they didn't want to be bothered with a child. It was easier than thinking they might have loved me." "I did love you," Keisha said fiercely. "I loved you enough to let you go, even though it destroyed me. And I've loved you every day since, even when I didn't know where you were or who you'd become." Jonathan reached out tentatively and touched her hand, the first voluntary physical contact between them. Her fingers were warm and calloused from hard work, real in a way that made his corporate world seem suddenly hollow. "What happens now?" he asked. Before Keisha could answer, Aiden looked up with 4-year-old pragmatism. "Now we're a family." The captain's voice suddenly filled the cabin. "Ladies and gentlemen, we've received clearance to continue to Honolulu." We'll be departing Maui in approximately 15 minutes. The announcement should have brought relief, but instead it shattered the fragile bubble of connection that had formed around the three of them. Reality crashed back with brutal efficiency as Jonathan's phone, finally able to connect to the ground network, erupted with notifications. 17 missed calls. 43 unread messages. His assistant's increasingly frantic texts about the Henderson Hotel acquisition, board members demanding updates, lawyers threatening to walk if the contracts weren't signed by morning. Jonathan stared at the screen, watching his carefully orchestrated business empire demanding his immediate attention. The weight of responsibility, of expectations, of the identity he'd spent decades building pressed down on him like a crushing wave. I have to, he began, then stopped, looking at Keisha and Aiden with something approaching panic. This deal, it's worth $40 million. People are depending on me. Keisha felt her heart constrict as she watched him retreat into the safe familiarity of his corporate shell. She'd seen it before, the moment when the walls went back up, when survival instincts overcame vulnerability. Of course, she said quietly, forcing understanding into her voice. You have important business to handle. But Jonathan caught the hurt she tried to hide, and it triggered something defensive in him. You don't understand. This isn't just about money. I employ 3,000 people. Their livelihoods depend on decisions I make. I can't just. He gestured helplessly between them. I can't just abandon everything because of some emotional revelation on an airplane. The words hung between them like a slap. Keisha flinched as if he'd physically struck her, and Aiden looked up from his coloring book with confusion clouding his innocent features. Some emotional revelation? Keisha repeated, her voice dangerously quiet. Is that what this is to you? Jonathan's phone buzzed again with another urgent message, and he glanced at it instinctively. The gesture, choosing his phone over her words, was the match that lit 28 years of accumulated pain. I should have known, Keisha said, her voice gaining strength as anger overcame hurt. Look at you. Look at this. She gestured at his expensive suit, his platinum accessories, the first-class lifestyle that separated him from everyone else. You've become exactly what I was afraid you'd become, someone who measures worth in dollars instead of hearts. That's not fair, Jonathan shot back, his own defenses fully engaged now. You gave me up, remember? You don't get to judge what I became or how I survived. The cruel accuracy of his words hit their target. Keisha's face went pale, but her eyes blazed with fierce pain. I gave you up because I was 16 and had nothing to offer you. But I never stopped loving you, never stopped hoping you'd become someone who could feel joy, not just success. Joy doesn't pay bills, Jonathan said coldly, falling back on the cynicism that had protected him for years. Love doesn't build companies or create jobs or. Love creates families. Keisha's voice cracked with emotion. Love is what made me search for you for 28 years. Love is what made you comfort a scared child on this plane, what made you promise to come back. But apparently that was just another business transaction to you. Aiden began to cry, overwhelmed by the raised voices and tension crackling between the adults. The sound of his distress should have brought them together, but instead it drove them further apart as each blamed the other for causing the child pain. This is exactly why I don't have a family, Jonathan said harshly, standing to leave. Drama, emotional manipulation, making children cry. This is what I avoided by staying alone. No, Keisha said, her voice deadly quiet now. You avoided this because you're a coward. You built walls so high that even when love finds you, you can't recognize it. I spent 3 decades believing I gave birth to someone better than this. The words hit Jonathan like physical blows, each one finding its mark in the deepest wounds of his psyche. The foster child who'd never been good enough, who'd been returned like defective merchandise, who'd learned that emotional investment only led to abandonment. Maybe you should have kept looking, he said with deliberate cruelty. Maybe the son you're searching for is someone else entirely. Keisha's sharp intake of breath was audible even over Aiden's crying. For a moment, Jonathan saw the full impact of his words reflected in her eyes. The devastation, the crumbling of hope, the death of 28 years of dreams. Maybe he is, she whispered, gathering Aiden closer to her chest. Maybe the son I've been searching for wouldn't be cruel enough to destroy his mother's heart just to protect his own comfort. Jonathan felt something shatter inside him as he watched her turn away, shielding Aiden from further emotional damage. Other passengers were starting to stare, drawn by the raised voices and palpable tension. "I need to get back to my seat," he said stiffly, his voice stripped of all warmth. "I have work to do." "Yes," Keisha said without looking at him. "Go back to your first-class bubble. Go back to your important business deals. Go back to being alone. It's clearly what you're most comfortable with." As Jonathan walked away, his expensive shoes clicking against the aircraft floor, he felt the weight of every bridge he was burning. Behind him, he could hear Keisha softly singing the lullaby to comfort Aiden, the same melody that had haunted his dreams for 3 decades. But he didn't turn back. He couldn't, because turning back meant admitting that everything he'd built his life on, self-reliance, emotional distance, the belief that success was better than love, might be wrong. And if that was wrong, then he'd wasted not just 28 years, but his entire life. The plane began to taxi toward the runway, carrying them all toward Hawaii, but leaving the possibility of family shattered in the ashes of words that could never be taken back. The lights of Honolulu glittered below as Flight 447 descended through the night sky, but Jonathan saw nothing beyond his laptop screen. For 2 hours, he'd thrown himself into work with desperate intensity, answering emails, revising contracts, pretending that numbers and negotiations could fill the void that had opened in his chest. But the spreadsheets blurred before his eyes, and every few minutes he found himself listening for sounds from the back of the plane. Aiden's laughter, Keisha's gentle voice, the melody of that haunting lullaby that had somehow lived in his soul his entire life. His phone buzzed with another message from his assistant. "Henderson Lawyers threatening to pull out. Need your signature on acquisition docs ASAP. The hotel chain will go to a competitor if we don't close tonight. $40 million. 3,000 jobs." His reputation as the corporate shark who never failed to close a deal. Everything he'd worked for, everything he'd defined himself by, hanging in the balance. Yet all he could think about was the devastation in Keisha's eyes when he'd called her revelation, some emotional revelation. The way she'd turned away from him, protecting Aiden from further cruelty. The hollow victory of walls rebuilt and bridges burned. 30 rows behind, Keisha stared out the window at the approaching lights of Hawaii, her dreams of reunion replaced by the bitter taste of disillusionment. Aiden slept fitfully against her shoulder, exhausted by the emotional upheaval he didn't fully understand. She thought about the job interview waiting for her tomorrow, the fresh start she'd planned for her and Aiden. Maybe it was better this way. Maybe discovering that her son had grown into someone cold and calculating was the closure she needed to finally stop searching, stop hoping, stop living in the past. But even as she tried to convince herself, her heart rebelled against the logic. The man who'd comforted Aiden during the turbulence, who'd known exactly how to calm a frightened child, who'd hummed her lullaby without knowing why, that man wasn't cruel. That man was the son she'd dreamed of finding, buried beneath 28 years of protective armor. She pulled out the worn photograph of Jonathan, studying his corporate headshot with new understanding. Now she could see what she'd missed before. The careful control in his expression, the way his smile never reached his eyes, the stance of someone perpetually braced for attack. He wasn't cold, he was terrified. "Mama." Aiden stirred, blinking sleepy eyes. "Is the airplane man still mad?" Keisha's throat tightened. "I don't think he's mad, baby. I think he's scared." "Scared of what?" "Scared of being hurt again." She smoothed his curls, thinking of all the foster homes Jonathan must have endured, all the promises broken, all the times he'd been moved or returned or told he wasn't wanted. Sometimes when people get hurt too much, they forget how to trust love when it finds them. Aiden considered this with 4-year-old wisdom. Maybe we should tell him it's okay to be scared. The simple suggestion hit Keisha like a revelation. She'd spent the confrontation trying to make Jonathan understand her pain, her years of searching, her dreams of reunion. But she'd never acknowledged his pain, the foster child's terror of abandonment, the successful man's fear of vulnerability, the son's anguish at learning he'd been given away. In first class, Jonathan's fingers hovered over his laptop keyboard, cursor blinking on the signature line of the Henderson acquisition. One click would close the deal, cement his reputation, validate everything he'd built his identity around. But his hand wouldn't move. Instead, he found himself thinking about Aiden's trust, the way the child had reached for his hand without hesitation. When was the last time someone had looked at him like that? Not as a means to an end, not as a business opportunity, but simply as someone worth trusting. He thought about Keisha's tears when she described holding him for 47 minutes, counting every second because she knew it was all she'd get. The magnitude of that sacrifice, a teenage mother's love so fierce she'd given up everything to give him a chance at something better, hit him like a physical blow. What if she'd been right about the love? What if everything he'd achieved meant nothing if he experienced it alone? His phone buzzed again. Another urgent message about the Henderson deal. But for the first time in his career, Jonathan powered down the device without responding. Some decisions were too important to make while hiding behind corporate armor. The plane touched down with a gentle bump, and passengers began stirring, gathering belongings, preparing to disembark. Jonathan remained seated, staring at the closed laptop that represented everything he'd been and the phone that demanded he stay that way. Then he heard it, Keisha's voice, soft and heartbroken, talking to Aiden. Sometimes people we love make choices that hurt us, but that doesn't mean we stop loving them. The words weren't meant for him, but they cut through every defense he'd constructed. She was talking about him, the son who'd just shattered her 28 years of hope, and somehow she was still choosing love over anger, understanding over condemnation. Jonathan stood slowly, his decision crystallizing with each breath. The Henderson deal would wait. His corporate empire would survive one night of delayed signatures. But this moment, this chance at family, at belonging, at becoming someone who could receive love instead of just achieving success, this moment would never come again. He walked down the aisle with purpose now, ignoring the curious glances of other passengers, ignoring the business-class sophistication that had defined him for so long. When he reached Keisha and Aiden's row, he knelt in the aisle, bringing himself to their level. "I'm sorry," he said simply, his voice stripped of all pretense. "I'm scared and I'm sorry." Keisha looked up, her eyes wide with surprise and cautious hope. "I don't know how to be a son," Jonathan continued, his voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know how to be a brother. But if you'll teach me, if you'll give me another chance, I'd like to try." Keisha stared at Jonathan kneeling in the airplane aisle, his expensive suit wrinkled, his corporate composure completely stripped away. For a heartbeat, she saw past the successful businessman to the frightened boy he'd once been, the child she'd held for 47 precious minutes before the world forced them apart. "You came back," she whispered, echoing the promise he'd made to Aiden hours earlier. "I promised I would," Jonathan replied, his voice thick with emotion. "I've never broken a promise to him. I don't want to start now." Aiden had been watching the exchange with wide eyes, and now he reached out to touch Jonathan's face with small, gentle fingers. "You don't look scary anymore." Jonathan caught the little hand in his, marveling at how something so small could anchor him so completely. "I was never scared of you, buddy. I was scared of myself. Scared I wouldn't be good enough to be your brother. But you're already good enough," Aiden said with the absolute certainty that only children possessed. "You made the scary go away twice." As passengers filed past them toward the exit, their small family bubble remained intact, immune to the bustle around them. Keisha reached out tentatively and touched Jonathan's shoulder, the one marked with the crescent-shaped birthmark she'd described. 47 minutes, she said softly. "That's how long I got to hold you before. Would it be okay if I held you again?" Jonathan's carefully maintained composure finally cracked completely. 28 years of walls crumbled as he leaned forward and let his mother's arms encircle him, Let himself be small and safe and utterly, completely loved. I looked for you, Keisha whispered into his hair, her voice breaking. Every day for 28 years, I looked for you. I never stopped believing you were out there, never stopped hoping you'd grown up happy and successful and loved. I wasn't happy, Jonathan admitted against her shoulder. Successful, yes. But I'm not happy. Not until today, when I heard a scared little boy crying and something inside me just knew I had to help him. That's love, Keisha said simply. That instinct to protect, to comfort, that's the love I put inside you during those 47 minutes. It's been there all along, waiting for the right moment to surface. They held each other while the plane emptied around them, flight attendants patiently waiting, understanding that some reunions couldn't be rushed. When they finally separated, Jonathan's eyes were red, but clearer than they'd been in years. I don't know how to do this, he said honestly. I've spent so long being alone, being self-sufficient. I don't know how to be part of a family. We'll figure it out together, Keisha assured him. That's what families do, they learn as they go. What about your job interview tomorrow? Jonathan asked, suddenly remembering the practical concerns that had brought her to Hawaii. Keisha's face fell slightly. I'll still go, but honestly, after missing my connecting flight and everything that's happened, I don't think I'm in the right headspace for it anymore. Jonathan was quiet for a moment, then pulled out his phone. What kind of job were you interviewing for? Hotel management trainee position. It was supposed to be a fresh start for me and Aiden. Jonathan's fingers moved across his screen with practiced efficiency. Give me the hotel's name. Why? Because, Jonathan said with a smile that transformed his entire face. I think I know someone who might be able to help. 15 minutes later, as they finally disembarked the plane, Keisha's phone rang. The hotel's general manager was calling to reschedule her interview and inquire about her interest in a management position. Not trainee level, but actual management, with a significant salary increase and full benefits. How did you? Keisha began, staring at Jonathan in amazement. I may have mentioned to the owner that an exceptional candidate was arriving tomorrow, someone with extensive experience in family services and hotel operations, Jonathan said with a grin. I also may have mentioned that Mitchell Technologies is considering a major corporate event contract with their property, contingent on their hiring practices meeting our diversity and excellence standards. You can't just manipulate business deals for personal reasons, Keisha protested, though she was smiling through her tears. Watch me, Jonathan said with playful arrogance. I'm a CEO. We manipulate things all the time. This is just the first time I'm doing it for love instead of profit. As they collected their luggage, Aiden tugged on Jonathan's jacket. Are you coming home with us now? The question hung in the air, loaded with possibility and uncertainty. Jonathan looked at Keisha, seeing his own hope reflected in her eyes. I'd like that, he said carefully. If it's okay with your mom, maybe I could visit? Get to know you both properly. More than visit, Keisha said firmly. Stay. For as long as you want. We have 28 years to catch up on. Jonathan thought about his penthouse apartment in Los Angeles, cold and pristine and utterly empty. Then he looked at this woman who'd never stopped loving him, this little boy who'd called him brother without hesitation, and felt something settle into place inside his chest, something that felt like coming home. I'd like that very much, he said. As they walked through the Honolulu airport together, Jonathan carrying Aiden on his shoulders while Keisha walked beside them, humming the lullaby that had connected them across decades of separation, passengers smiled at the sight of the obvious family reunion. None of them knew the full story. The corporate executive who'd discovered love was worth more than any acquisition, the mother whose 28-year search had finally ended, the little boy who'd gained a big brother simply by being himself. But they could see the joy, the completion, the sense of rightness that radiated from the three figures walking toward whatever came next. Jonathan's phone buzzed with messages about the Henderson deal, but for the first time in his career, he ignored them completely. There would be other deals, other acquisitions, other corporate victories. But there would never be another chance to learn how to be a son, a brother, a part of something larger and more meaningful than profit margins. As they stepped out into the warm Hawaiian night, Aiden pointed up at the star-filled sky. "Look how big it is," he said with wonder. Jonathan looked up, remembering the visualization techniques he'd taught the boy during his panic attack. "It's big enough for all of us," he said, understanding for the first time that he'd been right. The world was vast enough to contain both success and love, achievement and family, the man he'd become and the son he'd always been. Under the endless Pacific sky, 3 hearts beat in rhythm, finally whole. What dreams or hopes have you put aside that might be worth pursuing again, no matter how impossible they seem?